Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin.
Aidan Muir, you're one of many guests I've had over the years where it took me far too long to get you on here, coordinate timing and scheduling, but it's a real treat to have you. And for anybody who's not overly familiar, well, first of all, when they hear your accent, they'll know you're an Australian. So you're a dietitian, but it's spelled with a T instead of a C, like Taylor Ryan I had a while back. And not only that, you're the founder of Ideal Nutrition. So you have an entire team of dietitians that work for you. And you're one of the best people in the industry at creating accessible, evidence-based nutrition media, not sensational stuff, just the fundamentals that will self-select to people who want to be helped. So welcome to the show.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me.
Creatine. You talk a little bit about this. Creatine 101. Why you might consider taking it.
I think there's a bunch of reasons why you might consider taking creatine. I reckon the main one for most people is going to be muscle related in terms of building strength and muscle quicker. Technically, the research actually does show that people who take creatine build muscle 1/3 quicker than those who don't. That isn't lean mass, like that. We're actually talking muscle mass. There was a long time where people were like, is this muscle or is this just water? And we're counting that as lean mass. I would speculate over a longer time frame, it wouldn't be 1/3 quicker. For like research looking at things like 12-week studies, we see that. The other one that has been around for quite some time, but is definitely gaining more popularity recently is cognitive function, particularly potentially like helping to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's or delay the progression. And even a more recent one that has really come to light is when people are sleep deprived, having relatively high doses of creatine seem to help with cognitive function under those conditions too.
And this episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and the service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps, eating out, that costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me Meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes.
I'm familiar with all three of these. So I've seen sometimes people will make the claim that the muscle building benefits of creatine are actually pretty minuscule. Are they distorting data? Are they technically correct? What's going on there?
Yeah, that's why I'm pretty clear about the whole like 1/3 quicker. I couldn't tell you the name of the paper, but there is one paper that actually has been cited a little bit with people saying that it didn't build muscle. And one part of the logic that they use is they were looking at statistical significance in this paper. And we actually just look at the numbers. They built muscle 1/3 quicker. And so two people could be looking at the same paper and coming to a different conclusion based on that. And from memory, that was a review of a lot of research. So like it was 1/3 quicker. It's just like muscle growth is slow. So sometimes these things don't look like a big difference.
And as you said, because it's slow, I would think any advantage makes sense. And at least mechanistically, what we know about creatine phosphate and how the energy metabolism works there. I mean, we understand the mechanism behind it, and it should improve, your most anaerobic energy system for the shortest burst, most intense training. Resistance training is definitely in there. Anything explosive is definitely in that training window. So at least mechanistically, it makes sense to me, right?
Yeah, the absolute, like what I'd say the flaw is that it's going to help with ATP regeneration. Maybe that means you'll get out a few more reps here and there on certain sets throughout a session. Over time, the cumulative benefit of that is you might build more muscle. That's the logic. Something could be argued against with that logic is there are actually a lot of other supplements that could help with this theoretically. Like you could start looking at stuff like caffeine, beetroot juice, maybe citrulline malate. There's a long list, beta-alanine as well. And we haven't seen as kind of clear research for a bunch of these other ones for helping muscle growth, even though they are helping performance. So I'm like, the absolute flaw is it is helping performance, and that probably translates to muscle growth. But then there's some other stuff that people point to in relation to things like satellite cell signaling and stuff that like, it gets a bit like even deeper into the mechanisms, which is why I do like to just zoom out and be like, okay, we've got a bunch of different mechanisms. What do the outcomes show? Like, it does seem to help them.
I'm comfortable with that. And I mean, even though creatine is getting more expensive compared to what it used to be, it's still relatively inexpensive. And yes, the occasional person, will experience some GI distress. We seem to overwhelmingly, it's like side effect free, right?
This episode is brought to you by Macros First. I've always struggled with nutrition tracking apps, even the slightest hassle or friction, and it breaks my habit. That changed with Macros First. When I tried it, I told my friend, the founder, Jacob, quote, this is, well, let's just call it a certain other app on steroids. It's the easiest app to use, and it has a free barcode scanner, which if you use tracking apps, you know this is a really big deal. I recommend Macros First to all my clients and friends, and even had them sponsor my 2024 conference. Here's an example feature that I love. The verified food database. Remember using other apps and searching for a food only to find 10 to 50 similar options with different macros, not knowing which one to pick. This kind of friction is the shit that made me quit tracking altogether. Macros First, every single food item in the database, over 3 million of them, is human verified. No junk entries, so you can trust the numbers. Plus, that free barcode scanner makes logging faster. And if the barcode doesn't turn anything up, just point your camera at the nutrition label and Macros First will extract all the nutrition info instantly. All this just makes tracking easier. And while Macros First's premium version is incredible for any user, the basic version, which is nowhere near basic, is free to use. So you can go to either the Apple Store or Google Play to download.
Even talking about the like GI side effects, there is some research, and like I wouldn't read too much into this, but some research shows that when people have 3 to 5 grams of creatine or they have placebo, GI side effects are reported at similar rates. When we look at higher dose creatine, say like 20 grams, 25 grams, we see higher rates of GI instances. So I've got 2 kind of takeaways from that, where it is, one, I think when people take anything, they're often looking for this, particularly if they know that it's a common kind of linkage. But then 2, the fact that really high dosages or relatively high dosages of creatine do seem to be linked to this makes me also think that if somebody happened to be more sensitive, you probably would still experience something lower dosages as well.
Makes sense. Now, what about the research on the cognitive side of stuff? Because again, there's a lot of talk about this. If I understand it correctly, the supplementation, you see greater levels of creatine in the brain. Now, how confident are you about what this research is pointing to?
Yeah, that's interesting. How confident? I am not super confident. I'll tell you like my thoughts on the current state of play. My thoughts on the current state of play is that, one, I believe the take that creatine kind of preferentially gets stored in the muscles versus in the brain. And that also goes a bit in both directions. Like probably quite some time ago, people used to like act as if people who were plant-based would be dumber because they have less creatine in the brain. We don't have evidence of that. People who are plant-based, even though they have a low intake of dietary creatine or nearly zero, their creatine levels in the brain are similar to people who are omnivorous. It's almost like the brain just like holds it a bit more stable. But when we have really high doses of creatine, it does seem to increase the amount of creatine in the brain. So like, I do kind of buy into that a little bit. I see creatine as something that typically we view as a chronic supplement. So when we're looking at the muscle benefits, it's not like you have it pre-workout and then suddenly you're stronger in the session. It's something that kind of accumulates in the body over time, and then we see the benefits. But with the sleep deprivation stuff, it looked like you can just have a high dose of creatine and within a few hours, you're actually seeing some benefits. So there is a bit of an acute benefit there. Do I fully buy that? Am I 100% confident in that? No, but I am at a stage where I'm like, based on what we've got available, I do kind of believe that for now. And I do believe that if somebody took creatine consistently for a large period of time, that it probably does have some form of benefit for Alzheimer's prevention, but we don't have heaps of research on that too. So once again, if heaps of research came out that wasn't that positive, I'd change my mind pretty quickly on that as well.
And it's probably one of those things where if a fairly abundant supplement that's easy to access shows promise when it comes to potentially reducing rates of something like Alzheimer's, guess what? There's going to be tons of research coming on this. So we'll probably have some pretty good data given enough time.
It's almost surprising that it's taken this long in a way. Like, it's an area that I've looked into for a very long time, and up until relatively recently, a lot of it was mechanistic. And every time I'd hear a lot of evidence-based practitioners speaking very confidently on it, and every time I look at the research myself, I'd see it like, there's actually not that much, whereas we are getting some better data now. The other space in this area is the concussion area, where I reckon over a decade, it's been like pretty commonplace in the evidence-based world to talk about how creatine can help with concussion. When you actually go and look at the research, there isn't actually like randomized control trials, partly due to like ethical reasons. You can't just concuss people and test and see. Like, it's actually pretty logistically challenging to study, but it is another area where a lot of people say it with quite a lot of confidence. I believe it actually would help, but we don't have evidence just yet.
Pivot. Nutrition for PCOS. Is there anything special women should do if they have PCOS with their nutrition?
Yeah, for sure. If I'm going to jump straight to supplements, not normally my first one, but the first one I would jump straight to is inositol supplementation. And I have two reasons for this. The one that I'm the most confident on is that when women with PCOS supplement inositol, on average, the majority of symptoms improve. Note a bit of cautious wording there where I say improve. That's not me saying it like solves everything. That's me just saying, like, if you measured statistically, a large percentage of these symptoms will improve a little, is what we commonly see. If you've got a bunch of women taking inositol or a bunch taking other people taking inositol, on average, their symptoms improve in comparison. The other part of that is if you measure inositol levels in women with PCOS, on average, they have lower levels than those who do not have PCOS. And that is pretty well aligning with a lot of my thoughts on supplementation in general, where if people either have a suboptimal intake of something or they have inadequate levels of something, they're more likely to benefit from supplementation. So that is absolutely one of the first places I would start with most people. The other stuff is getting leaner in the majority of cases will help, particularly because insulin resistance is such a common thing. Not every woman with PCOS has insulin resistance, but it is far more prevalent. When insulin resistance improves, often a lot of the other symptoms also happen to improve alongside that. And there is decent evidence for doing things like slightly reducing carbohydrate intake and also lowering the glycemic index. Bit of a caveat with the carbohydrate intake one, where if you look at people talking about low carb diets for PCOS, and then you look at what studies they're citing, in a really, really high percentage of cases, they're citing studies where people are dropping from about 65% of carbohydrate intake down to 45%, and then using that to talk about a low carb diet. None of us would really consider 45% of calories coming from carbohydrates to be a low carb diet. It's just another space where we don't have heaps of research. Like, there's a few like rogue, like ketogenic, small sample size studies, no control group type thing, but we don't have anything that's like comparing 65% versus 45% versus 25%. So I wouldn't say going lower than that is not helpful. I could see potential benefits there. But one thing we do is if you get people with quite high carbohydrate intakes and you just moderate that a little bit, often we see symptom improvement as well.
And is that in part due to just lowering calories as a whole and therefore getting leaner? Because you said it helps get leaner, but as a population, I mean, a lot of women who have PCOS will ardently say it is hard, if not about impossible, to lose weight. So first of all, is it harder to lose body fat with PCOS?
Yeah, so we'll go with two angles here. So the first one is there is a bunch of research on basal metabolic rate in women with PCOS. And there was a time where a decent percentage of people in the evidence space community were either on the fence or potentially leaning towards it being a lower metabolism, which would definitely make it harder to lose weight. There's one study that really showed that. And I don't know if you saw that. Did you see the Stronger by Science like breakdown of this where?
I did see it.
Okay. So basically, and I was somebody who was a little bit skewed by this as well. I went and I saw somebody do a TED talk on PCOS, nutrition, stuff like that. And they referenced this one study about how women with PCOS have a lower metabolism. I did some of my own research. I could find like 3 other articles. 3 found no difference in metabolism. 1 found a really big reduction. So I was kind of sitting on the fence of it being like, oh, I could see the reduction being a thing. It's hard for me to say confidently. A lot of women report it being harder to lose weight with PCOS. Um, the Stronger by Science article that just like went through and just broke all of this down, found 15. That is, I was like, oh damn, like me searching, I found 4, they found 15. They've done a better job than myself. We got to the point that's like 14 studies found no difference. One did find a difference. And then when you like go really deep on like, why did that one find a difference? The consensus seems to just be that the machine that they use is dodgy potentially, or the testing protocol. That same research group has had some really wacky numbers come up in other areas where they're like reporting really low metabolisms in certain people, like really, really high metabolisms in others that just don't seem to line. We take that one study, pretty clear that metabolic rate is the same. That doesn't fully answer the question. That doesn't answer the question of, is it harder to lose weight with PCOS? There are a bunch of other variables that make it potentially harder. So one is differences in appetites and cravings that could potentially be hormonal related. We know there are obviously hormonal changes with PCOS. Two, differences from a mental health status standpoint. Like we know that depression is far more common in people with PCOS. And then 3, binge eating prevalence is really high in women with PCOS in comparison to people without PCOS. I could not necessarily tell you exactly why that is. I have a few speculations. One is in relation to that changes in appetite, cravings, etc. The other one is the mental health side of things. We know that binge eating overlaps with a lot of mental health conditions. And then a third one is that binge eating and other forms of eating disorders are far more common in conditions where people kind of would benefit from changing their diet and stuff like that as well. Like using a different example, but say like type 1 diabetes, where people have to have they have to like track their carbohydrates in some way, shape or form. Like eating disorders are far more common in that kind of area. And with the PCOS stuff where dietary changes help maybe increase the odds of this. And you start like combining a bunch of these variables and it does seem to make it harder. And I've got a fourth one I'm going to chuck in. I was speaking with a dietitian friend a while ago, and they said something, I probably wouldn't use this language, but it really did get me thinking about it, where there's something along the lines of, when we believe something is harder, sometimes it actually does make it harder. And I think the language he used was like a bit of a defeatist mindset, where it's like, if you think that it's going to be really, really hard to lose weight, it makes it harder. And you combine all of those variables, it does make it harder, I'd say.
In practice, I'll be, again, very careful how I use the language, because I can't say this specifically about PCOS and clients, but broadly, this is very true. If someone gets hold of a reason that they believe, and maybe it's a socially acceptable one, it's why I'm always a little bit cautious with genetics. I know genetics are quite potent when it comes to, especially the experience of food noise. It's one of the ones I've come to understanding because of GLP-1 agonist medications. But if someone has a reason to hold on to for why it's harder or something doesn't work, then it's a socially acceptable deflection from actually making the changes. Now, I think it's hard regardless, but I definitely see a pattern where if someone can, hold on to something, that it becomes a self-fulfilling belief. I think that's just very human nature.
Yeah, I think so. And because I don't want to make this like targeted PCOS, what I would use as a reframe is, I personally think I have some natural talents for running. I personally think I have some natural limitations for lifting. I think it's harder for me to gain muscle and size than other people. Does that belief make it easier for me to build muscle and build size? I would say the opposite, right? Does the belief of me thinking running comes easily to me? I think that helps me do that. We have seen that research, like the placebo steroid research, where people like believe they're taking steroids and they just make this like killer progress. And I do think that that kind of thing is relevant with some of this. So like we have all of those other like genuine challenges with PCOS. And then there is also this other side thing, which may or may not be relevant too.
That makes a lot of sense. So you don't advocate for dramatic low carb diets. I know in a post you also mentioned something about anti-inflammatory diets. What's going on there?
Yeah. So it is something that is linked with improved symptoms. Hard to say because I don't buy too much into inflammation being like a massive variable here, but it is linked with an improvement of symptoms, but there could be a variety of reasons. Like one of the most common ones is that if you start looking deep at the research on like what type of diets are anti-inflammatory as a whole, we start typically leaning towards like more Mediterranean style diets. And that's going to tick a bunch of these boxes because one is going to be higher in a bunch of micronutrients that could help. Even for example, we looked at on the insulin resistance side of things, like having more magnesium might help with that and a few other things like that. We typically would see a reduction in calorie intake, which would help a bunch of stuff. We typically would see a reduction in carbohydrate intake that would help with a bunch of that stuff. So like, I do think the anti-inflammatory side of things, I am curious as to whether is it the reduction in inflammation that's helping anything, or is it a combination of all the stuff as well?
Are there specific foods that you encourage people that are anti-inflammatory, or the opposite? Are there certain foods that tend to show up broadly as being inflammatory?
Yeah, so I go far more because you can take both sides of this stint. Okay, so I go towards the foods that are very like consistently shown to be anti-inflammatory. It's looking at like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, other healthy fats like avocado, extra virgin olive oil, going down that type of route. There is a thing that I believe it's called like the dietary inflammatory index out there, which is probably the most evidence-based area we have looking at inflammation. And it's a very broad look at stuff. It's the closest thing to an evidence-based thing we've got, because there are a lot of claims out there, like if we were to look at the sense of like what is very pro-inflammatory, you will hear certain things like dairy is pro-inflammatory, or wheat is pro-inflammatory, and a few others. And when you look at the dietary inflammatory score across broad populations, like those claims aren't necessarily true. If you go at the other end of like that kind of index, it will show some stuff that is pro-inflammatory, which I personally wouldn't necessarily have that take, but it would say stuff like sugar is pro-inflammatory and saturated fat is pro-inflammatory. Alcohol would probably have this, I'd probably join on that one, but like a few other things like that. And I often just take the stance that those things aren't necessarily pro-inflammatory. It is more so that other stuff is anti-inflammatory, but somebody could take the opposite perspective to me, and those are pro-inflammatory. The other stuff is more like neutral, so to speak.
I suppose it could also be the combination of the overall balance of the type of food someone's eating. If they're eating a lot of ultra processed food, there's a lot of alcohol in their diet. There's probably some other comorbid behaviors, maybe sleep quality is a little bit down, especially if there's a lot of alcohol. Then that could be a cocktail for an inflammatory environment for that person. And I presume dairy and wheat especially probably is a relationship between intolerances and allergies and inflammation here, which would skew the data.
That's why I use the phrasing like at a population level, because you absolutely will find people where it is more pro-inflammatory. Like we would say intolerances, we would say allergies, and I'm going to use an autoimmune one. Like let's say celiac disease. Somebody with celiac disease has wheat. It absolutely is inflammatory. Like it absolutely is going to be inflammatory for them. Like we see this in their intestines. We see these like villi, which normally have like heaps of surface area and stuff like that. Ups and downs just kind of become flat because of the inflammation, basically.
Excellent. What about mealtime? I grew up in the environment when I was training where we treated meal timing as the key to leanness. It was everything, right? And then the pendulum swung the other way. The evidence seemed to point to the fact that, broadly enough, the meal timing has minimal impact on leanness, but feels like it's swung back just a little bit, maybe on the performance side of stuff. So are there places where carb timing and meal timing actually makes a difference?
Yeah, I could talk for ages on this. Let's just jump straight into the like carb timing. Is there places where carb timing can help? So there absolutely is. It matters far more when your training volume is quite high and when you're training frequently. So for example, if somebody is training twice a day and they're doing quite a high volume, carb timing becomes really, really important, where you would want to be having, especially directly after the first workout, you'd want to be having high GI carbs relatively frequently within the first few hours to kind of replenish glycogen stores to get ready for the next training session. Even literally today, like I say this up all the time, but even today I saw somebody, I think it was Dan Kahn, Nutrition, he posted this thing about how if somebody had 10 grams per kilo of carbohydrates, which is super high, after like a morning session, and then like say trained again 12 hours later, their muscle glycogen is still only 63% repleted. Whereas like 10 grams per kilo is like a full carb load. You do that each day for like a 24-hour period and you would be fully loaded with glycogen. They're kind of making the point that even if somebody goes super, super high, like a 12-hour recovery window is quite small. But we do see this kind of like glycogen super compensation thing where you have carbs directly after a workout and help refuel glycogen quicker. The reason why I said really high training volumes and everything is that somebody does strength training 4 times a week, no cardio, no anything, and it's always 24 hours between sessions or more, then it probably doesn't matter that much because you don't like fully deplete glycogen. You don't really get close to doing that. You don't need to like really maximize this window for getting everything back in.
And what about the idea of modulating your calorie intake across different days in a week? Because I tend to be far more flexible with my clients. In fact, I try to talk to them about, I think consistency is actually a pretty good baseline, but I'm really like to have them armed with the flexibility of, if you go over on one day, then we can auto-regulate it across the rest of the week so that way it averages out to be our weekly average target versus, oh shit, we've blown it.
Yeah. I'm pretty big on that up until like quite a high-ish training volume. For like with most people, that is how I view it. For say lifters, I haven't really seen evidence that it matters if you're having slightly more on certain days and slightly less on other days for body composition and stuff like that. So that gives even more relevance to just the personal preference side of things, being like, if you went higher one bit, you can just go lower another. Where I do think it gets even more interesting to me, I do a bit more work in the endurance space now than I used to as well, where really high training volumes in those spaces, like let's say somebody does a long run on the weekend and they're doing 30 plus kilometers, and let's say that they might have a rest day somewhere else in the week or whatever. I will be moving their nutrition around partly to prepare them the best they can for that session, maybe even recover or whatever. And it gets a little bit more interesting because like say somebody's doing such a long run, say 30 plus kilometers, if hypothetically they had a rest day the day before, traditional thinking would have had me be like, okay, I'll have them have less food on their rest day. But what if the long run's in the morning? We actually want like heaps of carbs in the day before, then carbs in their pre-training meal, and then carbs when they're running as well. There's some of these runs where people get over 1,000 calories coming in while they're running just through gels and stuff like that. And I use that as a bit of an example about being like, well, if they're doing all that they have to be going higher in certain days to allow for that and therefore lower after. And in some cases, it literally could even be on that same day, later on after the run, they do actually just have like less carbs kind of out and stuff.
Let's talk nutrition tracking. And this one, even I don't know the answers to, and I think people struggle with. How do you track raw versus cooked when it comes to putting in numbers into your tracking app? My sponsor, Macros First, for example, right?
So raw weight is typically going to be the most accurate. That is gold standard. Can you do cooked weight? Of course you can. I would just account for it. One of the reasons why I would say raw is the most accurate is, I'm just going to use the logic here. Let's say your cooking steak and you've weighed out 200 grams of it. It has X amount of protein, Y amount of calories. After cooking, no matter what, it's still going to have X amount of protein and Y amount of calories. That's not going to change. It's still the same piece of meat. What if one version of you like undercooks it a little bit and the other version of you massively overcooks it? It's going to lose more weight when you overcook it massively. So if you were weighing everything and tracking based on cooked weight, you would be probably getting different numbers, even though what you actually consume is the same. Is that a big deal? Not really. Like for most people, I just don't think that matters too much unless there's a huge discrepancy. And in most cases, there won't be a huge discrepancy, but that's why we would lean towards raw weight first in most cases.
So what about something like lean ground beef, where you cook it, you're going to lose a lot of the fat, especially if you drain it. How do you navigate that with clients?
It is an interesting one. I've looked into this because I've done like on TikTok and stuff like that. I've done comparisons of like high fat ground beef versus low fat. Funny for me as Australians saying, if we say like mince or lean mince and stuff like that, I got a comment about this earlier today actually. But I've done like high fat versus low fat ones, and there have been people who've said like, oh, I just drained the high fat one, so it is now low fat. And I have looked into it quite a bit. And let's say 100 grams of high fat ground beef has 20 grams of fat. When you drain it, the absolute best case scenario is it comes down to about 12 grams of fat. The worst case is still more fat, like 15 or something like that. Whereas the lean one will have 5 grams to start off with. So like draining it won't fully get rid of all of this, but it will help. And I suppose I've indirectly answered it a little bit there with saying it will lose some, so you can and probably should account for that in some capacity. It's just hard to know exactly how much it loses.
I guess this does matter if someone is trying to make sure that they're hitting their fat minimums. But I suppose if you're also consuming lean ground beef, that's still a fairly high amount of fat, even at the leaner versions.
Yeah, in comparison to like white fish or like chicken breast.
Okay. And so the same thing goes for things like rice and oatmeal, way up by dry weight, which is what I've traditionally done. Okay. That one, I think, takes care of that pretty well. Okay. With the rise of hybrid athletes and people engaging in endurance sports, are there important nutrition strategies here? You sort of talked about this a little bit earlier. Is there anything that you really want to say, hey, this is the big rocks for someone who's starting to incorporate more long, distance, whether they lift, but they also want to get out and hike or run more?
Yeah, for sure. So firstly, I'd probably say just more calories in general. You can tolerate a lot more volume. So I would say that if we just look top end athletes in both sports individually, like if we looked at bodybuilding and powerlifting, most people seem to train 8 to 12 hours per week at the top end. We look at endurance athletes, most of them seem to train around 20 hours per week. Therefore, if somebody is becoming a hybrid athlete, firstly, if they just went from just lifting, they can actually just raise their absolute volume a little bit. But then secondly, you could almost make a bit of an argument being like, well, if you're doing a bit of both, you might even be able to go even higher. So most people actually, the energy expenditure will just increase, even the fact that endurance is going to be burning a little bit more. So higher total calories on average across the week. A lot of the other variables don't really change too much. Like we're still doing the same things with protein. We're still doing similar things with micronutrients and everything like that. I would be focusing on the carbohydrate timing a little bit more, particularly leading up to long runs, depending how far they get. I don't think I'd necessarily make too many changes for, say, hikes and stuff like that beyond just ensuring enough total calories. But the long runs and fueling throughout, whether it's gels, whether it's sports drinks, I would personally say once people start getting towards the 2-hour duration of anything, I would definitely be fueling. Though some people would say over 1 hour, I just go a little bit higher than that. And I don't know if this is interesting, but I'll even add some variables in there. If we're looking at endurance athletes, some of the best in the world are doing greater than 90 grams of carbs per hour at the moment while they're literally running or cycling or whatever. We have what are considered theoretical limits of 60 grams per hour for glucose seems to be what the body can absorb. 90 grams is like what a glucose and fructose combination the body seems to be able to absorb. When we're actually looking at what the pros are doing, they're going higher. It's kind of like the bodybuilding world when we have all the starter and protein. And you look at what the pros are doing, they're just like having these absurdly high amounts of protein. When we're looking at elite endurance athletes, or like the majority of them are going over 100 grams of carbs per hour, even though we have these theoretical limits. And somebody recently in an Ironman they won an Ironman and they had 200 grams of carbs per hour while cycling, which is crazy.
And they were not experiencing GI distress, because that's one of the issues when you bump up against that 60 and 90 is you start to experience GI problems. Now, is that a bell curve average, or is that, it seems to be like overwhelmingly across people outside of outliers, true outliers, once you get past that 90 grams total per hour, we start to see people just generally don't tolerate it well.
Yeah. And from what we've seen in research, like that is the case. The glucose one, like it's almost put out there as a bit of it's worded by a lot of people as if it is just a limit and there's not really much individual variation there. There's actually been, I haven't gone too deep on the recent research on this, but there was a bit of a consensus for a while that these carb intake numbers don't even scale based on body weight, which is almost a bit of an advantage to lighter athletes because they're able to take in as many carbs as bigger athletes, but obviously they're going through less. My understanding is there's also been some recent research that body weight does matter a bit, which that makes sense to me. Like, I can see that. Yeah. So there is the question of, do these like elite athletes have any adaptations that allow them to go higher? Do they have any natural abilities or genetics or whatever that just allows them to go higher? And that's actually part of why they're even more elite than they otherwise would be. There's a lot of questions there, but I do think it's at the stage that we're seeing so many people doing it that I would now lean towards, they're not doing this despite being limited to 90 or whatever. I would say it's probably helped.
Is there any evidence that if people consistently increase their carb intake, that they develop a greater tolerance without GI distress?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we call this concept training the gut. It's a very, very, very well accepted concept in the endurance world and the nutrition world as well. And I once saw somebody, like in every area of nutrition, there's like controversial takes and stuff like that. And I saw somebody make the claim that there's no evidence that this is a thing. And I thought about it from I've actually just kind of trusted everybody that this is a thing. I'm going to go look at the research myself. And when I looked at the research, it's incredibly positive. Like it is, there's research that within 2 weeks of training the gut, there is measurable improvements that are pretty massive, like 50% improvements in tolerance. It actually even extends even just beyond carbs to just water as well. Like if somebody's taking on water while running, they tolerate it better if they practice taking it on. So we can see pretty massive improvements quickly, which I like because a lot of people in that hybrid space are coming to see me often within 12 weeks of a race or something. So being able to see these improvements quickly, it's huge rather than it being this like long, slow process to build up this tolerance.
Could you just mention the water part? Because what is it? 1 gram of carbohydrates binds with 3 grams of water effectively. So let's say someone isn't consuming enough water in that case, and especially if they're doing endurance sport where they're sweating out a lot of water, which could be compounding it. Is that one of the mechanisms for the GI distress where you're getting a lot of carbs without the water to help bind with it?
Yeah, I don't know if exactly that's the mechanism, but something is pretty clear that having water helps. Almost all gels are designed to be consumed alongside water. Like the protocol is that people have a gel and around almost 250 ml of water alongside that. Even low key, that's a good idea just for like dental health. Like if you have a gel, you probably want to mouth rinse a little bit after with water as well. And we have a bit of evidence on sports drinks as well. This is another progressive area in the endurance world where once upon a time, drinks like, there's a reason why I drink like Gatorade and Powerade were all kind of formulated similar. And they were kind of formulated to really optimize hydration specifically. And they found that if carbohydrate went too high, it would change the osmolarity, which might then slow down the rate of hydration a tiny bit. Whereas something that some slightly more modern sports products are doing is really just pushing the carbohydrate higher and just accepting that it's like, okay, hydration will be a tiny, tiny bit lower, but we'll be able to get more carbs in. So I think as long as there's a decent amount of fluid coming alongside it, it doesn't necessarily, but it is a good idea to have fluid alongside that because that will distress.
Let's say someone is just starting out, they want to do more endurance stuff. Would you still say to them, at least at the start, try to stick within 60 grams of glucose and 90 grams total glucose and fructose per hour? And that has to do with different metabolic pathways that we metabolize glucose and fructose.
Yeah, so what I personally do is I'll have people often say a lowish, like 30 grams is probably the lowest I go. Everyone I've ever met can tolerate 30 grams. And then just raise it up over time. And I like to mention these numbers just because it gives people something to strive for. Like I'll mention all of this. I'll mention the 60, I'll mention the 90, and I'll mention the pros guide. Because if I just said to people, which is what I actually now view to be the truth, if I said to people, have as much as you can tolerate without it making your performance worse. If I just said that, which is what I truly believe to be true, I think a lot of people are a little bit soft and would probably get to like 30, 35, 40, and then be like, that's the sweet spot. I'm going to stop here. But if I say the 60 number, if I say the 90 number, almost every single person I've worked with has built up to at least 75 very comfortably. And many have.
Beautiful. I missed a question I wanted to ask earlier with the PCOS. So I definitely I want to cycle back to it. With the GLP-1 agonist medication, is there evidence that the GLP-1 medications, from what you've seen, work really well with PCOS, or are they, or does PCOS interfere with how effective they are against, let's say, the population who does not have PCOS?
That's a great question. So I think, because I haven't looked specifically at PCOS, so I'm going to go based on a few worlds here. So one is, I believe purely from the weight loss perspective, it's going to be at least as effective. There's absolutely no reason why I can't say it. But like, when I say at least as effective, like I would caveat that with, if it's harder for people to lose weight with PCOS, we're still going to be seeing it. I'm not saying at least as effective as being like, if the average person loses 18 to 20% of excess body weight or whatever on these, or total body weight on these, that people with PCOS will get the exact same. But it is going to be effective. The other one is when we look at it through the lens of the insulin resistance, like there is a chance that the GLP-1 does help with that, similarly to how they help with type 2 diabetes as well. So if anything, based on the combination of mechanisms, I see it as slightly more likely to be beneficial than anything.
Awesome. All right. I want to make sure I check that one off. Okay. Is there a relationship strong evidence that high fiber intake affects longevity?
Very much reduces the risk of chronic disease. It statistically reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease and also cancer risk. I'm pointing to those two specifically because if you live long enough, those two things are probably the things that are most likely you. Therefore, the fact that fiber statistically is linked to a reduction in both of those things, pretty clear sign that it probably helps longevity. You could then make other claims about being like, is it the fiber that's doing this, or is it reduction in calorie intake? Is it increase in micronutrient intake? Is it a bunch of all of these things? And I would say that, yeah, it's a correlation, but the evidence is strong enough that if longevity was something I cared about, I would have at least a decent fiber intake for sure.
Okay. Anything to counter some of the narratives where people are now popping up, making claims or hearing talking heads say that we don't need fiber or that fiber is actually somehow actually detrimental?
So the first one is exactly what we just spoke about. And there is a chart, I posted this on social media, it'll be a while ago, so I can't really point to it, but it literally just charted fiber intake and risk of chronic disease. The higher people got to quite an absurdly high intake of fiber, the lower the risk of chronic disease. And I know that is just correlation, but it's such like a linear correlation. I'm like, or if I was going to have the opposite stance that we don't need or benefit from fiber, I'd be very cautious and I'd want to really, really, really know stuff. I would use, looking through their lens, is the statement we don't need fiber accurate? Technically, that's accurate. There's heaps of things in this world that we do not need. I hate to use another analogy, but like, I don't need a mobile phone. I can exist without a mobile phone. And my life is just better. I don't need a laptop. My life is just better. And I kind of view like fiber the same way, where it's technically not essential, just the same as carbs are technically not essential as well. I also would have a lot of caution in relation to long-term data. I'm not going to say that there is zero research or anything like that, but there are many cases where I think some people are saying some absolutely absurd things with extreme confidence. I'm not going to name names again, but there's one person, and he's using American units, so I can't use the exact units, but in Australia, we use millimole per liter for cholesterol. And he was on a carnivore diet, reporting having 15 millimole per liter cholesterol, like total cholesterol rating, which what we'd call high cholesterol. This is absurdly high. And he was talking about how in the absence of high blood glucose levels, this is totally safe. And fair enough, if you believe that we absolutely do not have data with large sample sizes for a long period of time with people with those types of ratings. And that's also how I view about the low fiber stuff. We have very, very clear data that on almost a linear fashion, the higher fiber you go, below the risk of chronic disease. We don't have that type of data with really low.
I'm satisfied with that. All right. Last quote that I pulled out of your media. Quote, not every nutrition decision needs to be something sustainable you can do for the rest of your life. Talk to me about that.
You've gone deep into the archives. That's a while back, but I really like that. So almost every piece of nutrition content or whatever I put out there, it's not in relation to myself, it's in relation to people I work with and everything like that. But this is one I've thought about specifically in relation to myself. I am very lucky that I've grown up with a great relationship with food. My parents didn't nail everything, but something that they nailed was relationship with foods. And I'm entirely grateful for that. And that comes easy to me. Certain things like getting lean and stuff like that, that comes easy to me. And the entire sustainability process also comes easy to me because I have been very consistent with nutrition for a very, very, very long time. And it's got me thinking about this one key point. There's a lot of lines out there where people say you shouldn't start something or you shouldn't start a diet that you can't stick to for the rest of your life. I've thought about that a lot because I'm like, that's not even how I live my life. Like there's one thing that like, I feel like I'm doing really well, comes very easy to me, all of these things. I don't do that thing. Why would I put this rule on others? And being specific, like let's say I was to go into a fat loss phase. There are certain decisions that I make during those phases that don't align with how I want to live my life long term. For example, I might just like not drink alcohol pretty much at all. And would I make exceptions? If my best friend had a wedding, like, yes, maybe I would have some drinks there. For all of the 50-50 decisions, should I not, or whatever, the answer would always be no. But do I want to live my life that way forever? I met my fiance on a dating app, and in her bio, she said something like, "I just want somebody who will bring a bottle of wine when I cook dinner." I feel like something along those lines. It's like, do I want a glass of wine with my fiance occasionally? Yes, that is something that's a part of how I want to live my life long term. Therefore, these two things don't necessarily coexist. If I was doing like a week fat loss phase, maybe if she offers a glass of wine, I say no every single time during that fat loss phase. And then outside of that, I rebalance my life in other ways. And that therefore makes me view sustainability over this long-term thing, being like, can I be consistent during that fat loss phase and also with how I would like to live my life long-term? Every individual will have their own thing, but we also do this in other areas of life as well. Like with work, there have been times I've worked 60 hours per week. Do I want to live my entire life that way? I would not want to spend all of my 20s and 30s doing. I would like to, I have other hobbies, I have other things I care about. But do I regret doing that? No, there's times that I think that that makes sense to do. It's all about sustainability over the long time, not like if I just had a rule being like, oh, I should never do that because I can't do that for the rest of my life, it would possibly make my life worse. And that's very personal examples there. But this thing, as I said, comes easily to me. Why would I make a rule that makes it harder for other people? It's less about what you necessarily do during that specific phase, and it's more about what you do over time. If you were to do something that you can't sustainably maintain forever, the game plan should involve how do you transition that phase.
Sounds perfect. I guess through the lens of what we were talking earlier about competition, especially, for endurance, you're going to be doing certain things with your nutrition there that aren't going to be long-term sustainable either. All right.
Everyone's in training and stuff like that. Like marathon runners, they go up to these absurdly high volumes, and like somebody could do these high volumes knowing full well that they were not going to do that for the rest of their life, but they have this goal.
Beautiful. Appreciate having you on. Everybody can follow you at Aidan, AIDAN _the_ dietitian, Australian spelling, DEITITIAN. Okay. And it's fun with Aidan. It's my middle name, and it is AIDAN, right? So a lot of people get tripped up there. But anyway, you guys should be able to get that. I'll obviously have you tagged in my social media as well. Is there anywhere else you'd want to send people to get more of your resources?
Instagram's definitely the main place, but the other one is the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. We basically do 20-minute episodes on a variety of nutrition topics on there as well.
Deeper dive to what we did here. So we did a lot of quick hitters, but great information. Everybody tuning in, if you really enjoyed this, I not too long ago had a fellow Australian dietitian, Taylor Ryan. She's wonderful. And some of the stuff that you talked about, especially the end about different phases, reminded me of a conversation I just had with Hattie Boydell, who's also an iconic Australian competitor coach. Wonderful. So if you're interested in listening to any of that stuff, message me. I will send you the links. I'm easy to get on Instagram. I would love to see you there. Tell me what you thought of this episode. Aidan, thanks for coming on. I appreciate you.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me.